Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Centre, McGill University. For this recording, I am thrilled to be joined by Professor Justin Raycraft. Professor Raycraft is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Lethbridge, having earned his PhD in anthropology at McGill University last year. He is author and co-author of several notable articles and book chapters, including those published in the African Journal of Ecology, Anthropology and Humanism, and World Development. In this podcast, we are discussing his solo-authored article published in Human Organization in 2021, which is entitled Islamic Discourses of Environmental Change on Swahili Coast of Southern Tanzania. Professor Raycraft, thank you very much for agreeing to this podcast. Firstly, I just wanted to ask you to discuss your article in broad brushstrokes. It draws on ethnographic fieldwork conducted in Msimbati, a rural village on the Swahili coast of southern Tanzania. Why this village in particular? What were your intentions when you embarked on this fieldwork? And how did being there shape your research questions and findings?
Thanks, Philip. And first of all, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this podcast. And it's great to meet you and find out about this wonderful initiative that you've got going, bringing together a variety of scholars working on East African history. So to go back to my paper, it began in a sense under the supervision of Dr. Vinay Kamat at UBC. And I would just preface things by saying I believe he has a book proposal on the go that should come out in the next few years. And so if this particular talk is of interest to people, I would encourage them to keep an eye out for his work in the future. And when I began this study, in a sense, I had been interested in the political economy of health, which might seem like a total pivot from the actual content of this paper. And I had some experience working in Swaziland. At the time, the country was named Swaziland. Recently, it's been renamed to Eswatini, working with miners who had moved to South Africa. And as a consequence of their sort of labor-related mobility, they had different sorts of health outcomes than those who had stayed put, particularly working in mines and along the lines of infectious diseases and the spread of them. So I had been interested in the dynamics between migration and health. And I had spoken with Dr. Kamat about this particular ethnographic context. And he had mentioned that with the increasing constraints on the local fishing economy, there was possibly a trend of young men moving out of the village to other places to find work. And so I was interested at the time in sort of documenting some of those dynamics and linking it back to health. What ended up happening was once we got to the field and we sort of arrived in various villages along the coast on motorbikes, Msimbati, which became my ultimate field site, hosts the main office for the marine protected area. And when we went to sort of introduce ourselves to the park managers in the office, we found that the roof of the office had been destroyed. People had actually blown up the office with dynamite. And we sort of came to realize that there was discontent and local level resistance to the very prospect of marine conservation in this village. So that's why I sort of ended up steering towards that topic and working in Msimbati in particular. And of course, that sort of pulled me away from health research and medical anthropology into the domain of environmental anthropology and looking at what we sometimes call the human dimensions of conservation.
Once you were there, can you just kind of briefly outline your research methodology? What challenges, I suppose, ethically and practically did you face in your fieldwork, if any? And how did you overcome them? And I suppose there's probably theoretical grounding you can mention here too.
Yeah, and I should sort of continue that story a little bit more to say that I arrived in a sense at a series of research questions that sort of emerged from the field itself. And that was in a sense to do with how local communities felt about marine conservation, how it sort of affected their everyday lives, particularly in the context of their livelihoods. And that, of course, was sort of an umbrella topic that covered a variety of interrelated subtopics. And And of course, what we find in anthropology is that it's sort of the messiness of life in practice. There aren't really neat boxes that sort of allow us to categorize topics into one particular domain or another. It's really about documenting the particularities of everyday life in an ethnographic context. So the methods, in a sense, were very kind of Malinowskian. I just arrived on a beach with a bag in hand. Msambati is on the Mtwara Peninsula, and in a sense, it's a very remote part of the country, and you have to cross a little bridge with a culvert underneath, and in some senses, it becomes an island when the water sort of moves into the wetlands from the ocean and sort of surrounds the village. So you get this sort of sense of isolation when you're working there. And I was at the time still learning the language of Kiswahili and really trying to get a sense of what was going on. And so the method, in a sense, was about emplaced participant observation, trying to develop an understanding of the rhythms of everyday life and what people did to sort of to get by, in a sense, and how they derived meaning from their everyday lives. And so very anthropological in that sense, and the findings, I think, will sort of start to unfold them as I move along, but there were quite a broad set of wide-reaching findings.
So you transitioned to working with the idea of environmental anthropology, and you translated the word mazingira, which is Swahili, as the environment. And I wonder, could you kind of expand on this word mazingira? Does it cover the same semantic range as the English word? In other words, how did your respondents conceptualize the environment, and how does that conceptualization shape the narrative you offer in your article?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there was sort of concern around this kind of linguistic chasm between, in terms of translating from English to Swahili. And Dr. Wally at MIT wrote a book called Rough Waters, where she was looking at the social and political dimensions of marine conservation on Mafia Island in coastal Tanzania. And she sort of has quite a few pages that sort of dig into this. And in her sense, mazingira was sort of born as almost a neo-colonial term that was a way of sort of projecting Western understandings of the environment onto a cultural context that it didn't quite map onto one-to-one. So there are some concerns, particularly when we think about the concept of nature and how it, whether or not it translates. But that said, it is still a word that is used very much in people's everyday discourse, and they very much understand what it means and use it in a particular set of ways that I would say does reflect relatively closely how I think of the term environment. And so there are certainly some issues to take into account in terms of how we think about meaning and in the context of nature and the environment, but it was the term that I ended up using. And there are perhaps some limitations to thinking about environmental change through a lens that is in some senses more of a Western one.
Okay, so your interviewees, they were primarily people who you refer to as Makonde. Now, for non-East African specialists, they will probably not know who or the history of the Makonde. Could you just give a little bit of an overview of who the Makonde are? How do they define their identity? And what is their relationship and position within the town or village of Msambati?
Yeah, so in a sense, the Makonde are relatively recent in terms of the deeper history of East Africa. They're relatively recent migrants to the Swahili coast, based on sort of oral accounts generated from other scholars. It seems that around the 14th or 15th century or so, they called the areas around Lake Nyasa or Lake Malawi home, and they probably practiced some form of fishing on Lake Malawi. And at some point after the 15th century, they began a series of migrations towards the coast. During that time, they sort of began to branch off into different groups, and more or less they followed rivers, and at some point they crossed over, and different groups settled on different plateaus in a sense. And one particular group made its way all the way to the coast of Mtwara and became sort of entangled in a cultural sense with Islam and what we call sort of the Swahili coast. And this was the Tanzanian Makonde who now live in Msimbati, which is a village on the Mtwara Peninsula where I did my work. In terms of their cultural practices and identities, nowadays on the Swahili coast in Mtwara, they are fishing communities and largely dependent on the inshore fishery for livelihood, with dugout canoes, and they fish for a variety of coral reef fish in the inshore fishery. Some with access to larger boats do pursue offshore fishing, but this isn't as common. And they also more or less depend on farming as well. And farming is a little bit more challenging in this area because of the saline soils close to the coast. So there's some level of cashew farming that goes on that's sort of brought to market in town, and very small scale leafy greens and tomatoes and onions that sort of form some of the standard dishes that people eat. In some parts of Mtwara, wheat and rice could be grown, but it's not as widespread as it is in the interior. And so they've developed their own sort of economic system relative to that particular coastal environment. And their cultural identities are tied to their own long histories of as migrant people from the interior, but also tied very much so to Islam and the Swahili coast. An interesting sort of dynamic that sort of sets the Makonde apart from some of the other groups that moved from the hinterlands to the coast is that those who sort of adopted Islam developed sort of a set of distinctions with some of the Makonde that ended up settling in northern Mozambique. And there's sort of more of a cultural distancing than you might see with some of the other groups that moved to the coast. And so there are some frictions and internal tensions across some of these Makonde groups. But of course, an important question that I think is taken up in other contexts by scholars is the extent to which their engagements with Islam are nominal relative to their pre-existing identities as Makonde people, or whether it's something that's sort of come to sort of occupy a very central role in their identities compared to their historical origins. And probably the reality is somewhere in between, where it's kind of this synergistic blend of aspects of their cultural worlds that they surround themselves with.
So you've highlighted a number of issues here related to food systems and also Islam. I'm going to ask you questions on both of those topics, but I'll start with the one on food systems. You mentioned agriculture and fishing, and also you discuss a lot in the article about structural inequalities as well. And therefore, I wondered, how do climatic and economic conditions put pressure on local food systems? How did local respondents understand those pressures? And were there different understandings between fishers and farmers?
Those are sort of very important questions that frame a lot of my interpretations in a sense. Climatic conditions, one of the big ones throughout Tanzania is rainfall. Of course, that tends to vary. Most of the time you have bimodal patterns of rainfall, which mean there's sort of a punctuated set of dry and wet season. There are also sort of prolonged droughts that occur over periods of time. And so obviously those bear directly on farming practices, crop cultivation, because there aren't advanced irrigation systems in these areas. These are rain-fed farms. So when there are variable conditions in rainfall, and let's say increasing drought over time, then that puts a lot of pressure on the farmers. Economic conditions, I think, is another important one to highlight, because in this particular part of Tanzania. It's in a sense a political periphery that has its own history beginning in the colonial period, and it was at one point sort of coveted as a potential area where it could be where ground nuts could be exported back to Britain. But then when that enterprise failed, it was sort of neglected as a region. And some of those same patterns of neglect, selective neglect, you could call them, kind of continued through the post-independence era, where it's such a far periphery geographically as well as politically, right in the very southeast point of the country, adjacent to Mozambique. So there is a sense a sense that people have to sort of make their own means to sort of provide for themselves rather than sort of receive governmental services. And that likely led to a very high dependence on the coastal fishery. Unfortunately, the coastal fishery in recent years has not been particularly productive. And it's complicated to sort of ascertain why those declines have occurred. Of course, there could be environmental factors at play. It could also be to do with offtake at the local level, although this would have to be empirically proven, and that's certainly challenging to do. But what is certain is that there have been some declines in the productivity of that fishery. And so that sort of change, coupled with the effects of a lack of rainfall on farming, and the widespread poverty and lack of formal employment opportunities that are around, have sort of altogether compounded this sense of insecurity that you get in rural Mtwara. So these are the sort of the political and economic environmental factors that frame everyday life.
And thinking about those factors, in what ways do they inform the response to the construction of the marine conservation building, which you said had been blown up by dynamite, and also natural gas projects which are occurring in the region as well?
Yeah, so that's another aspect of people's environments, right? Their lived environments, these new kind of, from their perspectives, mega projects in a sense that are being implemented all around them by various stakeholders that are not from the communities, usually government stakeholders in partnership with private companies that see the environment in a particular way, see it in terms of natural resources that can be commoditized and extracted or sort of bound and protected and used to promote tourism. The community sort of see these aspects, these processes happening, and they feel like they don't have control over the circumstances that affect their everyday lives. And particularly when they're living in conditions of poverty, when there are environmental constraints on their livelihoods already. And then you have these actors that are from outside the communities coming in and essentially trying to monetize or exploit the resources that are available there. People develop this sort of resentment and this feeling like, in some senses, a sense of helplessness that we don't have control over what's going on. And that to me was probably the reason why people responded by blowing up the park office. I mean, that if we interpret that in a sense as a gesture of agency, as a form of overt resistance to say we won't sort of roll over and take this, it shows some of the things that can be done to push back. But I think if you start to unpack agency in a little bit in a broader sense, and of course that was an acute instance, but over a longer period of time, if you're there in the village and you're living and you're talking with people, it struck me that there was sort of a set of discourses that was coming up around how people came to terms with things that they felt were outside of their control, and these aspects of their environments that they were able to sort of, in a sense, externalize, and for good reason, probably because a lot of these processes were being driven by actors that were outside of their communities, in the context of the natural gas extraction project and marine conservation. The natural gas extraction project in particular is sort of a great example of this, because the government, in partnership with several foreign companies, was extracting natural gas from Mnazi Bay, just off the shore of the village, and people can see it happening. And then through a loan from the Import-Export Bank of China, they were building a 500-kilometer pipeline all the way to Dar es Salaam, with the intention of sort of generating electricity in the commercial capital of the country. And yet at the exact same time, there was this marine protected area that was sort of encapsulating that extraction, and local fishers were being told they're not allowed to fish in their dugout canoes. And so people sort of developed this sense that the resources were being exploited by people from outside of the community. It was something that was outside of their control. And so in their everyday discourses, they started to kind of refer to these things that they felt they didn't really have say in, and they didn't have autonomy to determine how these processes would unfold. They sort of began to classify all these different aspects of their environment under the broader umbrella of God's plan. And so that was sort of where my interest in this particular religious explanatory model came about. Was I was fascinated with how all of these elements of the environment, whether it was lack of rainfall, whether it was extractive industry, whether it was changing market conditions, these were all sort of being grouped together as in a relational sense as representative of the fact that villagers did not feel they had control over the circumstances of their everyday lives.
Now, this focus on God's plan is really kind of at the core of the article, which is entitled, as I mentioned, Islamic Discourses from the outset. I suppose that kind of begs the next question. One of the recurring themes of your interviews is the perceived role of God as a provider, as a being who has control over soil fertility, climate, crop yields, and markets even. And I suppose when we think about, on the one hand, extraction and conservation, also the other kind of big global development movement is also, I suppose, sustainability and responses to climate change. And I suppose when you think about your interviews and your responses, which focus on the role of God in an understanding of the environment, I wondered if you could kind of expand. What does this tell us about the need for locally grounded and culturally specific responses to the challenges of climate change and structural inequalities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things I sort of wrestled with was the extent to which people's responses, where they were sort of mentioning God's plan, the extent to which those were sort of idioms that could have been manifest basically in any ethnographic context anywhere, and there were sort of more surface level discursive things, or whether they sort of represented a more deep-seated way of knowing and worldview. And that, I think, took some time for me to unfold. And to some extent, it's probably both, that there is an idiomatic aspect to that in the language that they use. But at the same time, it did seem to me to be ubiquitous enough that it was representative of a way of thinking about their place in the world and how they saw themselves relative to all these changes that were going on. And there's a number of sort of implications that can come from that, depending on what particular aspect of environmental change one is trying to study. So some aspects of their environment are very much under their control, and they're well aware of this. What farming practices they use, let's say questions around which fertilizers and when, what fishing practices they engage in, what types of equipment they use, and how they regulate their offtake and access to the fishery and those sorts of things. Those are very much under their control. So how they sort of conceptualize their own locus of control is certainly significant, because if people are just externalizing things altogether, they might not draw the connections between their practices and the impacts. That said, we have to take that line of argumentation with a big heap of salt, because in my experience, people have very sound understandings of their everyday lives and the impacts of their actions and their practices, and they have all sorts of customary institutions at the local level to regulate access. And so they seem to me to have a pretty good grip on things in that sense. But the larger sets of influences, like climate change or something that's probably is outside of their locus of control, certainly in terms of the drivers, but even in terms of the processes that are ongoing at a regional level, in terms of government responses to them and such, people are feeling like those are largely out of their control too. And I think there's something to be said for tailoring. Let's say you want to take an adaptation type of approach or coping with environmental change. Well, those have to be grounded in local conceptions of the environment, what aspects of the environment people find meaningful, how they sort of see themselves and how they envision the future and what their aspirations are and how they envision their own sense of control and positionality and all of this. I think those are important aspects to take into account, particularly if there are going to be some, let's say, climate-related initiatives that are put in place that might directly constrain local livelihoods further. I think though that has the consequence to make people's everyday lives even harder, which I think we should be cognizant of when we're making these kinds of climate-related policies.
Thank you, Professor Raycraft. Those are really interesting questions, and I think leave us on a really good note to kind of stop the conversation about your article there. Think about the possible wider implications of the article and how to ground this in a wider context. Before I let you go, however, I just want to ask you one final thing. I know you've just started a post at the University of Lethbridge. I imagine that's a bit of a whirlwind for you. But what are you working on now? What can we expect to see, read, or hear about from you in the near future?
Yeah, so I continue to do research, ethnographic research in Tanzania. For my doctoral work, I worked in northern Tanzania with Maasai pastoralists, particularly in the Tarangire ecosystem and the areas adjacent to national parks, which are unfenced areas, and there's a dispersal of wildlife that occurs seasonally into community land, and a variety of sort of community-based conservation areas and initiatives that are ongoing in community lands outside of national parks. And so my research is based on participatory and collaborative research with pastoralists in that ethnographic context. And sort of the thematic bridge to this particular study in Mtwara is that question of how communities feel about conservation, how they situate it in relation to their livelihoods and the things that matter most to them. And so that's sort of the main focus of my current work. And related to that, there's a series of smaller studies on human-elephant conflict and human-carnivore conflict, particularly elephants in the maize farms of local farmers and carnivores attacking livestock for the herders. So there's a number of issues at play in an applied sense. And again, it always seems to come back to that question of how communities think about these wider processes of conservation and development that are affecting their lives. So keep an eye out for that. And that's something that I'll continue to be working on for the next few years.
I very much look forward to hearing more about that. And as I'm sure you know, but listeners may also be interested to know that this issue of conservation amongst the Maasai is a very hot button topic right now. And you'll absolutely be able to find a wealth of journalistic information on the conflicts currently occurring in northeastern Tanzania. Anyway, thank you very much, Professor Raycraft, for your research and for discussing with me today. I also want to thank Sam Glee-Riemann for organizing and producing the podcast. And I would like to thank you, the listener, for streaming and or downloading. Once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and this is the Indian Ocean World podcast.
We would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The Indian Ocean World podcast is produced under the SSHRC-funded partnership Appraising Risk Past and Present. The podcast runs in conjunction with the annual speaker series at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University, Montreal.